The floors of Ashfair Hall were cold even in October, and Cecily Marne had learned to feel the difference between the marble of the entrance hall and the worn stone of the back passages through the thinning leather of her shoes. She had been at Ashfair for 7 weeks. She had not yet met the Earl. She had not expected to meet him that morning. It was a Tuesday, gray and damp, the kind of morning when the light through the tall windows lay flat and without warmth, and the household moved at the slow, purposeful pace of people who had long since ceased to believe in anything so fleeting as autumn sunshine. Cecily was on her knees beside the fireplace in the east corridor, which was the corridor no one used, and therefore the corridor that no one had scrubbed in what appeared to be several years. She had a brush in her right hand. She had a bucket of cooling water to her left. She had folded into the pocket of her apron a letter from her late father's solicitor, informing her that the small sum he had set aside for her education had been consumed by the costs of his burial, and that she was, in the precise and bloodless language of the law, entirely without resources. She was working methodically, as she did everything, starting from the left and moving right, because her father had taught her that chaos could be managed if you chose one direction and held to it. She was not thinking of the letter. She was not thinking of the 6 months since his death, or the 2 months in Mrs. Hartwell's house in Bath, where she had attempted to be a paid companion and had lasted 8 weeks before Mrs. War. Hartwell's preference for weeping over her own ailments, while Cecily read aloud, became something neither of them could sustain. She was thinking about the stone, and the brush, and the next 2 feet of floor. She heard the footstep behind her and assumed it was Mrs. Oakes, the housekeeper, who had the particular heavy tread of a woman who had decided long ago that carpets were an affectation the male residents of any household did not deserve. It was not Mrs. Oakes. The silence that followed the footstep was different from Mrs. Oakes's silence, which was the silence of a woman gathering herself to speak. This was the silence of a man who had stopped walking because something had surprised him and who had not yet decided what to do with the surprise. Cecily looked up. The Earl of Ashfair was standing 6 feet away from her, still in his riding coat, which was black, as everything about him was black. His cravat was the only exception, and it was very nearly gray. He was not a young man, but he was not old. Somewhere in the middle gears of a face that had once been handsome, and had become something more austere through whatever decade had worn it into its current shape. He had dark hair beginning to silver at the temples, and dark eyes under dark brows. And the expression on his face was the expression of a man confronted by something for which he had no prepared response. Cecily got to her feet. She did it without hurrying, because hurrying would have been an admission of wrongdoing, and she had done nothing wrong. She held the brush at her side. She waited. "Who are you?" the Earl said. It was not quite a question. It had the cadence of a man thinking aloud and expecting the thought to answer itself. "Cecily, my lord," she said. "I was engaged as a temporary charwoman by Mrs. Oakes 3 weeks past. I was told the east corridor had been neglected." The Earl looked at the corridor. He looked at the section she had cleaned and the section she had not. He looked at her bucket. He looked last and longest at her. "You were told correctly," he said, and walked on. "If you are still finding your way into this story, leave a quiet word in the comments, and return with us to Ashfair Hall, for it is only the first morning, and there is so much yet to see." She was 24 years old, the daughter of a schoolmaster who had loved his books better than his finances. And she was not, by any reasonable measure, a woman the House of Ashfair was designed to see. She was not unattractive. Her face was too honest for prettiness, or so Mrs. Hartwell had told her, which Cecily had privately decided meant that she did not make the right expressions at the right times, and she was not unintelligent. She was simply, as the cook had told the scullery maid in a voice calibrated to Carrie, not quite what one would call a proper domestic, too educated for her station, and no station above it to go to. The dismissive label had reached Cecily's ears with the efficiency of a well-run household, not quite what one would call a proper domestic. She had written the phrase in the margin of her mind, and folded it away with the solicitor's letter. She was very good at folding things away. What she had not expected, and what she could not fold away so easily, was the Earl himself. He returned to the east corridor the following morning. She was cleaning the window panes. He walked past, stopped, and said without preamble, "The frames are rotting." "Yes, my lord," she said. "The third one in from the end." "I know which one," he said, and walked on again. He was in mourning. This much the household had told her in the way households tell things, through the accumulated weight of small observations rather than a single declaration. Oakes had mentioned the Countess once, in a tone suggesting the subject was closed. The cook had mentioned 10 years. The footman James, who was 17, and could not keep information inside himself longer than 4 hours, had told Cecily that the Earl had loved his wife very much, that she had died of a fever the winter after they were married, and that he had worn black ever since. James had delivered this information with the solemnity of a bishop, and the complete absence of irony of a 17-year-old who has not yet encountered a grief he could not name. Cecily had listened. She had not asked questions. She had gone back to her work. The Earl, for his part, had begun finding reasons to walk the east corridor. She noticed it on the 4th morning, when he appeared while she was applying linseed oil to the wainscoting. He did not speak. He stood for a moment at the end of the corridor where the light came in cleanest, and she saw him look at the window she had reported. The frame had been repaired, she noted, and recently. He looked at her, and then he walked away. On the 5th morning he appeared with a book under his arm and said, as if continuing a conversation they had been having, "What did your father teach?" She paused. "Everything, my lord. Mathematics, Latin, a little Greek." He said nothing for a moment. He said, "Come inside when you are finished. Mrs. Oakes will show you where to wash." She came inside. She washed. She was taken to a small sitting room near the library, where a pot of tea had been laid, and where the Earl of Ashvere sat opposite her and asked her to read to him from a volume of Virgil he had placed on the table between them, because he wished, he said, to hear how well she had been taught. His face was entirely grave. His voice was entirely level. His hands, she noticed, were absolutely still on his knees. She read. Her father's voice was somewhere in the Latin, as it always was, and she allowed herself to inhabit it for a moment, before she locked that particular door and continued. When she finished the passage, he said, "You translate in your head." "Yes, my lord, that is unusual." "My father was unusual," she said, before she could stop herself. The Earl looked at her for a moment that lasted several seconds too long for politeness, and then he said, "You may continue with the east corridor. Tomorrow, the north passage also wants attention." She was dismissed. She curtsied and went. She told herself, walking back through the servants' passages, that this meant nothing. A man who had worn black for 10 years was not a man building toward anything. He was a man who had chosen his life and arranged it carefully. And she was a temporary charwoman who happened to read Latin, and that was the complete sum of what had passed between them. Her body disagreed. Her body was very clear on the subject, and she did not find this helpful. Ashford Hall had also, it transpired, 2 other residents of consequence, who had not been present in the first weeks of Cecily's employment. They arrived together on a Thursday in a crested carriage that swung into the drive with a speed suggesting urgency, or irritation, or both. Lady Dorothea Ashvere, the Earl's aunt, was a woman of 62 who held herself as though the world had been arranged primarily for the purpose of disappointing her. Her companion was Miss Louisa Fenwick, a young woman of 21, with a complexion like a Meissen shepherdess, and the smile of someone who had been told her entire life that she was the obvious choice for any room she entered. Cecily learned their names from James, who had them within the hour. She observed them from the corridor, where she was cleaning the bronze on the wall sconces. Lady Dorothea swept past her without looking at her. Miss Fenwick glanced at her briefly, with the particular quality of glance that takes inventory rather than greets. "The charwoman," Lady Dorothea said to no one in particular, in a voice designed to carry to exactly the people she intended to wound, is that girl with the schoolmaster background. Apparently she reads Latin. Lionel must be desperately in want of entertainment if he has taken to conversing with the help. Cecily continued polishing the sconce. The bronze came up very well. She was aware in the days that followed that a different kind of pressure had entered the house. Lady Dorothea had come with a purpose that all of them could feel, the way one feels a change in the weather before any cloud appears. The purpose arrived formally at dinner on the third night of her visit, when Lady Dorothea announced to the Earl, in a tone that made clear this was less announcement than declaration, that Miss Fenwick's father had spoken with the family solicitor, and that the settlement was, in every respect, entirely adequate. Cecily did not hear this herself. Mrs. Oakes told her, not from unkindness, but from the particular instinct of a woman who believes that those below stairs should understand precisely what sort of house they are serving. Mrs. Oakes delivered the information with the care of a person placing a piece of fine china on an unsteady shelf. The Earl has not yet spoken, Mrs. Oakes added, which was, in the context of her general economy of speech, almost tender. "Thank you, Mrs. Oakes," Cecily said. She folded it away. She was becoming a very good folder of things. The Earl appeared the next morning in the library, which Cecily had not been assigned to clean, and which she had therefore entered only because the east passage adjoined it, and she had needed a specific cloth from the shelf inside the door. She had not expected him to be there. He was sitting in the large chair by the south window with a letter open in his hand, and he was not reading it. He was looking at the window. His face had the particular quality of absolute stillness that she had come to recognize as his expression. For whatever he kept deepest, she should have withdrawn immediately. She was already retreating when he said, without turning his head, "Miss Marne." She stopped. "My lord, I beg your pardon, I required a cloth." "Take it," he said. She took it. She did not leave. He said, "Do you find the work difficult?" "No, my lord. I was not speaking of the scrubbing," he said. She looked at him. He had turned his head by then and was looking at her with those dark eyes that gave nothing away, and yet withheld things so specifically that their withholding felt, paradoxically, like a form of speech. "The circumstances are not what I would have chosen," she said at last, with the honesty that had gotten her dismissed from 2 positions already, and would almost certainly account for the third. "They are, however, manageable. I find most things manageable if I can identify which direction to work from." Something shifted in his face. It was very slight. She would not have noticed it if she had not been watching him as carefully as she was, which she ought not to have been. "That is a sensible approach," he said. "My father taught it to me," she said. "He was a great believer in the application of method to grief." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "How long has he been dead?" 6 months. "It becomes less sharp," he said. And then, as though that sentence had cost him something he could not afford to spend, he turned back to the window and said nothing more. She left. She stood in the east passage for a moment with the cloth in her hands, and allowed herself to understand that she was in considerable danger, and that the danger had nothing to do with her employment. The 6th week of her time at Ashvere brought a dinner party. Lady Dorothea had organized it, as Lady Dorothea organized everything, with the precision of a general who knows the ground, and has decided in advance who will be placed where. There were 16 at table. Cecily was not at table. She was stationed in the corridor to assist with wraps, a task that belonged in theory to the footman, but which Oakes had redirected to Cecily, and which Cecily understood perfectly well to be Lady Dorothea's preferred method of keeping the schoolmaster's daughter visible in her correct position. She stood in the corridor, therefore, and the guests came and went past her, and she took their wraps and returned their wraps, and she heard the dinner through the walls in the way one hears music from a room one is not permitted to enter, as tone and rhythm without specific word. Miss Fenwick came out to the corridor mid-evening alone, which was not quite proper, and which suggested she had arranged it. She looked at Cecily with the thoughtful expression of a woman making a calculation. "I hope you are comfortable at Ashvere," Miss Fenwick said, with the particular warmth of someone who does not mean warmth, and knows you know it. Quite. Thank you, Cecily said. I imagine it is a considerable relief, Miss Fentwick said, to have found something suitable, given your circumstances. She paused. One hears the schoolmaster's daughter has rather made herself at home. She supposes he is lonely, and novelty has its season. She went back inside. Cecily stood in the corridor and breathed very carefully for a moment. Then she went back to taking wraps. Because there was nothing else to take and nowhere else to be. And because her father had believed in the application of method, and she was her father's daughter. The Earl came out to the corridor himself, very late, when the other guests were still at port, and the women had been returned to the drawing room. He stood in the doorway for a moment as if he had not entirely decided to come through it, and then he came through it. And he looked at her. You should not be standing here alone, he said. Mrs. Oakes assigned me the position, my lord. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, I see. And the way he said it, the very particular quality of the way he said it, told her that he saw rather more than the assignment, and that what he saw had made him angry in the quiet, contained way that was the only way he appeared to be anything. She wanted to tell him that it did not matter. She was very strongly aware that this would have been both untrue and inadvisable, and so she said nothing, and he went back inside, and she went home that evening with a tightness in her chest that was not quite sorrow, and not quite something else. If this story is sitting beside you in the quiet of the evening, you already know how these things build, the way stone walls are built, one course at a time, patient and without announcement, and if you are inclined to leave a word in the comments, this is the moment, for what comes next is the heaviest thing she had yet been asked to carry. She found out about the miniature by accident. She was cleaning the study, which the Earl had extended her assignment to include the study, a decision she had not been informed of directly, but which had appeared, written in Mrs. Oakes's careful hand on the week's schedule, and she was dusting the mantelpiece when she found it. It was a small oval, framed in silver, and it contained a painting of a young woman with a bright face and light hair and an expression of considerable amusement, as though whoever was holding the miniature had just said something she found both absurd and delightful. The young woman in the miniature looked nothing like Cecily. She was everything Cecily was not, in terms of the brightness and the ease and the particular confidence of a woman who had never had to fold things away. The Earl appeared in the doorway without warning, and she had the miniature in her hand, and there was nothing to be done about that, except set it back on the mantelpiece and wait. He looked at the miniature. He looked at her hand from which it had come. His face was entirely without expression. Her name was Alice, he said. She died in March of 1808. He said it the way one says a thing one has rehearsed so many times the words have lost their edges. She liked to laugh. She was very good at it. I was not particularly good at it, and she thought that was hilarious. Cecily stood very still. She did not say she was sorry because he had heard it 1,000 times, and she did not say anything else because there was nothing else to say. She would have thought, the Earl said after a moment, that a schoolmaster's daughter cleaning my east corridor was the funniest thing she had heard in years. He left. Cecily set the miniature back exactly as she had found it, at precisely the angle and the precise position, and then she stood at the mantelpiece with one hand on the cold marble for a moment, before she resumed her work. Her eyes were very dry. She was good at that too by now. She understood him, in the way that one can understand something, without being able to name it properly. He had carried that miniature for 10 years on a mantelpiece in a room he used every day, which meant he did not want to stop seeing her face, and he had worn black for the same 10 years, which meant he had not yet decided to be someone who had come out the other side of the grief and was building something new. He had built nothing new. He had maintained Ashfere Hall and attended to his tenants and read Virgil and walked the East Corridor, and for 10 years he had made his life very small and very orderly. She told herself for the first time, allowing herself to name the thing she had been telling herself since the first morning, that she should leave, that she should give her notice, accept whatever she was owed, and find a position somewhere he would not appear in doorways asking whether she found the work difficult. She told herself this. She did not act on it. The crisis arrived, as crises do in great houses, not with a declaration, but with a piece of paper. Mrs. Tamber. Oakes brought it to her on a Wednesday late in the afternoon, with the expression of a woman delivering a verdict she has been asked to carry, but has not issued. It was a letter in Lady Dorothea's hand, informing Cecily that her services at Ashfield would no longer be required after the Friday of that week, as the household's requirements were being reorganized, and that she might collect what she was owed from Mr. Brash, the steward. The reason was not stated. The reason did not need to be. Mrs. Oakes said, "I had no part in this," which was, from Mrs. Oakes, a significant declaration. "I know," Cecily said. She went that evening to return 2 volumes of Virgil she had borrowed with the Earl's permission from the library. She intended to leave them on the table and go. The Earl was in the library. She had not expected this. She set the books on the table and turned to leave, and he said, "Sit down." She sat. He looked at her for a moment. "My aunt has told me," he said, "that she has written to you." "Yes, my lord." "I have also been told," he said, and the quality of his voice had changed in a way she could not precisely identify, "that she described you at dinner as not quite what one would call a proper domestic, and also as the schoolmaster's charity case, and also as the sort of small embarrassment that larger houses collect when their masters have lost their judgment." Cecily was very quiet. The fire was the loudest thing in the room. She said these things to Mr. Rast, Fenwick's solicitor, the Earl said, who repeated them to Mr. Brash, who told James, who told me. He paused. "My household runs on gossip with the efficiency of a watermill, and I have long since stopped objecting." "It is very efficient," Cecily agreed, before she could stop herself. That thing shifted in his face again. This time it was undeniable. "You are not a charity case," he said. "You work harder than any person in this house, and you read better Latin than my own tutor could manage, and you told me the 3rd window frame was rotting 2 days before the frame actually failed, which is the kind of observation that saves a household significant expense." He paused. "These are not the qualities of a small embarrassment." She looked at her hands. "My lord, I do not think your aunt is entirely wrong, that my position here is irregular. Your position here," he said, "is what I make it." She looked up at him. He said, "I am asking you to stay. Not as a charwoman." He stopped. He began again, with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing each word the way one chooses the next foothold on uncertain ground. "I am aware that I have done this very badly. I am aware that I have not given you any rational reason to trust that what I am about to say is anything other than a comfortable aberration. I am asking you to forgive that, because I am not practiced at this, and because you are the first person who has made me want to practice at it. In a very long time." The fire crackled. Outside, a wind had picked up, and the last of the October leaves were going from the trees that lined the drive. "What are you asking, my lord?" she said. "I am asking," he said, "if you will allow me to call on you properly, with Mrs. Dupotis. Oakes as chaperone and whatever appropriate formality you require." He looked at her steadily. "I am not asking you to forget that you are standing in my library in an apron. I am asking whether, in spite of that, you might consent to be seen by me in a different light." She thought of Alice's miniature on the mantelpiece. She thought of 10 years of black. She thought of her father, who had believed that grief was manageable if you chose a direction and held to it. "I believe," she said slowly, "that you should know I am exactly what you see. There is no inheritance concealed somewhere. There is no useful family. There is a small collection of books in a trunk in the attic room, and my father's watch, and 7 weeks of wages." She paused. "I would not wish you to discover that later and feel deceived." "I know exactly what I see," he said. "That is rather the point." She looked at him for a long moment. His face was grave and still and entirely sincere, and underneath the sincerity there was something that was not quite hope and not quite fear, but was somewhere between them. The particular expression of a man who has stepped out of the life he had arranged and is now standing in the open without a plan for what comes next. "Then yes," she said, "if it is properly conducted." "It will be properly conducted," he said. He looked at the Virgil she had set on the table. "You may keep the volumes." She took them. She went to the door. She paused. "She would have laughed," Cecily said, "if she knew." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said at last. "She would have laughed a great deal." Cecily went to bed that night with the Virgil under her arm and something warm and somewhat alarming spreading outward from the center of her chest, and she allowed it to be there, which was new and which she suspected was the beginning of something she would not be able to fold away. The difficulty was Lady Dorothea. Lady Dorothea Ashfare was not a cruel woman, in the strict sense. She was a woman who had organized her entire life around a particular understanding of what things meant, and the understanding was this: rank was the axis around which all other considerations properly revolved, and that any deviation from that axis was not simply socially incorrect, but genuinely morally wrong. She had arranged for Miss Fenwick. Miss Fenwick had family, fortune, face, and form. She was appropriate in every way that could be measured. Miss Fenwick had been prepared her whole life to be the correct choice, and the correct choice had been ignored in favor of a woman who cleaned floors, and this was not, as far as Lady Dorothea was concerned, something she was prepared to absorb quietly. She began her campaign on a Thursday morning in the drawing-room, where she received callers with the precision of a general reviewing troops, and where Cecily happened to be replacing the candles in the sconces along the south wall, having been assigned this task by Mrs. Oakes in a manner that suggested Mrs. Oakes was keeping her close to hand for reasons of her own. Mrs. Pembridge, who was the wife of the local magistrate, and the social center of the county in a 10-mile radius, arrived at 11 and was served tea, and Lady Dorothea said, within hearing of 2 footmen, Mrs. Bendra, Oakes, Cecily, and a small spaniel who lived under the chaise, that she was very much afraid that her nephew's grief had affected his judgment in ways the family had long feared, that a man who had worn mourning for a decade was not a man in possession of his full faculties, and that it was very sad when a girl without family or fortune or any claim on the notice of a great house could take advantage of a widower's loneliness to make herself indispensable by means that did not bear examination. Cecily replaced the final candle. She set the taper back in its holder. She walked out of the drawing-room without looking at Lady Dorothea, because to look at her would have required an expression she was not prepared to permit herself. The Earl was in the entrance hall. He had heard. He had the particular quality of stillness of a man who has heard something he cannot unhear, and who is deciding, in the 3 seconds available to him, exactly what to do with it. He looked at Cecily. She looked at him. "Do not," she said, quietly, before he could speak. "I intend to speak to my aunt," he said. "You will speak to her," Cecily said, still quietly, still steady, in a way that will make her twice as certain and 4 times as determined. "I would like to manage this myself, if you will allow it." He studied her. "How?" "By continuing to be exactly what I am," she said. "Which is what she cannot account for." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Very well," and then, lower, so that only she could hear, "You will tell me if you require anything." It was not precisely a command. It was not precisely a request. She went back to her work. Lady Dorothea escalated. She called upon Miss Fenwick, who appeared at Ashvere for tea on the Friday, and sat across from the Earl in the drawing-room with the composure of a woman who has been told she will win and believes it, while Cecily moved through the adjoining library, replacing books that had been misfiled. She was aware that this was deliberate on Lady Dorothea's part. The display, the comparison, the calculated adjacency of what Miss Fenwick was to what Cecily was not. The Earl sat through the tea with his hands still on his knees. He said very little. He said it politely. Miss Fenwick's composure held. And then, somewhere near the end of the second cup, the Earl said, in a tone of complete courteous neutrality, "Miss Fenwick, I have heard from my aunt that your father is interested in the Dorset property. If that is something he wishes to pursue, he should contact Mr. Brash directly. He paused. The conversations regarding a settlement were conducted without my knowledge and should not have begun. The composure did not shatter. It contracted, which was almost more interesting to watch. Miss Fentwick said, "I see," in a tone remarkably similar to the tone Cecily had heard the Earl himself use. And she set down her cup, and she rose, and she left with the posture of a woman who has been given a verdict she has not yet decided whether to accept. Lady Dorothea followed her into the hall. Cecily, replacing the last misfiled volume, heard the two voices, one high and controlled, and the other lower and rapid, and then silence. The Earl came into the library. He stood for a moment beside the shelves. Properly conducted, he said, to the room, rather than to her, though he was looking at her. "Yes," she said. "Then I will speak to my aunt," he said. "Now, this evening, while she is still here." He paused. "You were right, that she will be certain and determined. She will be certain and determined regardless. The difference is whether she believes she has my permission." He left. Cecily stood in the library with a volume of Cicero in her hand and listened to the house breathe around her, and thought that she had been wrong about a number of things and right about a number of other things, and that the balance was still unclear. She would not know until the following Saturday which way it fell. The following Saturday was the last day of October, and Lady Dorothea had organized in what appeared to be her final move in the campaign a small gathering of the neighborhood's principal families, the Pembertons, the Roth family from Combe, the Darcys of Winbourne, and several others to meet at Ashvere for an evening of cards and music. Miss Fentwick had been re-invited. Cecily had been assigned to assist with the refreshments. She was carrying a tray of glasses through the drawing-room when Lady Dorothea spoke. Lady Dorothea had positioned herself near the fireplace, which was the center of the room, and the people around her were the Pembertons and old Mrs. Roth and 2 or 3 others, whose names Cecily knew only from context. Lady Dorothea was speaking at a volume that required an audience and repaid one. "One feels," Lady Dorothea said, with the measured sadness of a woman sacrificing discretion for duty, "that a man of Lionel's standing ought to have someone near him who could manage the responsibilities of a great house properly. I have suggested this to him more than once. The difficulty is that grief makes men susceptible to certain influences." She paused, with the precision of a woman who has planned the pause. "Unsuitable attachments. Of the kind that do not bear scrutiny." The room had shifted toward her. It did this for Lady Dorothea the way a garden shifts toward the sun. The door from the hall opened. The Earl of Ashford came in. He had not been expected at that moment. He had been expected from the study, which was in the other direction, and he came instead from the hall, which meant he had entered through the front of the house, which meant he had been outside, and his coat was cold. He was still in his greatcoat, and had not yet removed his gloves. He walked across the room. He walked with the even, unhurried pace of a man who had decided where he was going, and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. He walked past Lady Dorothea. He walked past Mrs. Pembridge and the Pembertons. He walked past Miss Fentwick, who was standing near the pianoforte, with a glass of ratafia, and an expression of calculated composure. He walked to where Cecily was standing with the tray. He took the tray from her and set it on the nearest surface. He looked at her face for a moment, and what was in his face was something she had never seen there before. Not the withholding, not the stillness, but the thing that lived underneath both, unguarded for the first time. He said, "Miss Cecily Marne is to be my wife. I have asked her. She has agreed. Anyone who objects is welcome." To leave the room was absolutely silent. 12 words. She had not counted them in the moment, but she counted them afterward. In the quiet of that night, 12 words that had the weight of everything he had not said in 10 years. Lady Dorothea said. And then she said nothing else, because there was nothing else to say that the room had not already absorbed. Mrs. Pembridge, who was a magistrate's wife and therefore accustomed to the settling of verdicts, said, "Well," and then in a tone that was not warm and not cold, but was the tone of a woman acknowledging something irrevocable, she said, "Miss Marne, and nodded. Miss Fentwick set down the ratafia. She did it carefully, without any particular expression, and she said to the room generally that she believed she had a headache and would have the carriage sent round, and she left, and nobody said anything because there was nothing to say, and the room exhaled. Cecily looked at the Earl. He was still looking at her. His gloves were still on. He had not moved. He was waiting, she realized, for something from her. And what he was waiting for was simply acknowledgement, simply the answer, simply the thing she had said in the library 2 weeks ago, and was being asked to say again, in front of the people who needed to hear it most. Yes, she said. I have agreed. The tension went out of his shoulders. It was very slight. She suspected no one else saw it. He said, "You will want to sit down," and she nearly laughed, because it was such a very characteristic thing for him to say, and because she had been holding the tray for 20 minutes and her arms were in fact quite tired. She sat down. He sat beside her. Lady Dorothy excused herself, with the dignity of a woman accepting a defeat she has not finished processing, and went somewhere deeper in the house. The gathering continued, because gatherings always continue, because the social machinery of a Regency October is not so easily derailed as all that, and because Mrs. Pembridge called for someone to play the pianoforte, and the youngest Miss Darcy obliged, and conversation resumed with the quality of rain after a storm, steady and settling, and little surprised to find itself peaceful. Later, much later, when the guests had gone and the house had quieted and Mrs. Oakes had made a point of finding Cecily in the small sitting room and saying nothing at all, while pressing her hand very briefly and very firmly, Cecily went upstairs and found on the table outside her attic room the 2 volumes of Virgil she had returned, and beside them a 3rd volume she had not seen before, and on the cover of the 3rd volume, in the Earl's precise hand, a card that read, "The North Passage also wants attention. When you have a moment." She stood in the corridor and laughed. It was quiet, and she had her hand over her mouth, and it was entirely genuine, and it felt like a door she had not known was closed coming open into air. They were married in January, in the small church at the edge of the Ashfere estate, in the cold white light that January provides when it is being kind, which is rarely, but which it managed on that particular morning with something that felt almost like intention. Mrs. Oakes was there. James was there, barely contained by the occasion. The Pembertons came, and the Darcys, and several others who had, in the weeks since the October gathering, quietly readjusted their positions with the pragmatism of people who understand which way a thing has settled. Lady Dorothea came. She sat at the back of the church, with the expression of a woman who has chosen, with considerable effort, the correct posture for a situation she had not chosen. She did not speak to Cecily directly. She did look at her, once, as Cecily came down the aisle, and the look was complicated, and Cecily met it without flinching, and that was sufficient. The Earl wore, for the first time in 11 years, a coat that was not black. It was a very dark blue, which was the closest he had been willing to come, and Cecily did not think less of him for it. She thought the navy suited him considerably better than the black had, and she told him so, in the vestry, while the church behind them murmured itself back to settling, and he looked at her with that thing in his face that was no longer withheld, the thing that had been living underneath the stillness all along. "My father wore blue," he said. "It was a waste to let the coat go unmade." "It was not a waste," she said. "It was a decade of grief. That is a different thing." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "It is." She had brought nothing much to Ashfere. The trunk of books was hers and her father's watch, and 7 weeks of wages that she had not spent, and the 3 volumes of Virgil. She had not brought an inheritance, or connections, or any of the things the marriage market had decided a woman ought to bring in order to be worth choosing. She had brought the ability to read Latin in her head, and the knowledge of which window frames were rotting, and the understanding that method, applied with patience, was the correct response to grief. The study remained as it had always been, with Alice's miniature in its place on the mantelpiece. Cecily had not moved it. She had never intended to move it. The Earl had once, in the early weeks of the new year, found her dusting around it with the care she gave everything. And he had watched her for a moment, and then he had said quietly, "She would have liked you very much." "I think," Cecily said, "I would have liked her." "You are not so different," he said, "in the ways that matter." She thought of the bright face in the miniature, the expression of amusement, the ease of a woman who had never needed to fold anything away. She thought she and Alice Ashfear were perhaps not so similar as all that, but she also thought that the Earl saw something true, because he was a man who saw things truly, and that was, after all, precisely what had made him see her. By February, the East Corridor was entirely finished. The North Passage had been done since November. Cecily had begun a survey of the house, room by room in the mornings, while the Earl was in his study, and she brought him the results in a small notebook each week. She noted the frames that wanted attention, the hinge that had begun to fail on the third landing, the damp coming in through the north wall of the kitchen. He read her entries with the same focused attention he had given the Virgil, and he acted on each one, and the house improved around them the way houses improve when someone finally turns their full attention to it. One morning in February, very early before the household had woken, she came downstairs to find him already in the East Corridor. He was standing at the end where the light came in cleanest, the same place he had always stood, and the February morning was white and still, and the frost on the glass turned the light silver. He heard her step and turned. She was in her house dress, not yet properly arranged for the day, and her hair was not entirely up, and she was carrying the notebook because she had found another entry to add, and she had thought she was alone. He looked at her in the silver morning light, with the same quality of attention he had always given her, the attention that had over 7 weeks of a temporary charwoman, arrangement in all the months that followed, accumulated into the most significant fact of her life. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. They stood for a moment in the cleaned corridor, in the cold February light, and the house was very quiet, and the frost on the glass was very still, and the woman who had come here with a brush and a bucket in October, now Cecily Ashfear, and a solicitor's letter telling her she had nothing, held her notebook and looked at her husband and understood. With the clarity that sometimes arrives without warning in the early mornings of very cold days, that she had been seen, and that being seen was the beginning of everything. She held out the notebook. "The second window in the south gallery," she said. "The frame is going." He took the notebook. He read the entry. He looked up at her with that thing in his face that would never be withheld again. "I will have it seen to," he said. She nodded. She went to make tea. The miniature stayed on the mantelpiece, catching what light the winter offered, and the house held them both. And February moved toward March, and the frost on the East Corridor's windows softened, degree by degree, into spring. If Cecily's story has stayed with you past the closing image, leave a word below, and thank you, truly, for staying until the end.